Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hyperfriend. Today with my good friend Phil from Acuutech. And before we introduce you to the topic for today, Phil, just tell us who you are and who's friendly is Acuutech.
Of course. So, hi everyone. My name is Philip Moss. I am Chief Product Officer at Acuutech, and Acuutech is a services organization. We're based in the UK, but we have offices in Singapore and North America. And really, we focus on building advanced solutions built on Microsoft technology. But the key difference is that we're focusing on business outcome. So we are delivering business benefits-based solution driven by advanced Microsoft technology. But a comment I always say internally is we do tremendously advanced engineering, so our customers don't need to. And that's really the difference in the value Microsoft brings to our partner and our customer ecosystem.
And you're one of the most experienced partners we have right now. And that also brings us to the topic. You are one of those partners who automated the whole deployment of HCI in certain configurations for your customers. You're working also heavily with Lenovo and other partners now. And really, the strong point I see here is really with the automation, with your experience, also your heavy discussions with my personal friends on the product groups. And yeah, that's our focus for today. Why automation of HCI is so important for deployment, for adding it in a new node, and also for a scenario like rip and replace of a node especially.
Indeed. You know, to answer that question, I'm actually going to do a little bit of history. So my background, a lot of my engineering college background, is really in the managed service provider space, what used to be known as the application service provider back in the late 90s. And what's interesting about that sector back then is that we were all trying to have multiple organizations running on a single set of infrastructure, sharing platforms. When you're doing that, you had to be able to repeat things easily, right? That means you can't do things manually, which means you have to use automation. Now, that set us on a path from a very long time ago to deploy Microsoft-based infrastructure solutions using automation. Back then, it was things like Windows Scripting Host. But obviously, when things like RDMA and PowerShell came along, they became logs extensions. So what happened is that, through the early 2000s, we were building a lot of automation around, building out at scale Windows infrastructure. And as we moved forward into the hyperconverged infrastructure on Server 2016 and then Server 2019, this requirement to deploy storage spaces direct, software-defined networking, and Hyper-V became absolutely key, right? And of course, then doing it with Azure Stack HCI becomes a logical extension. Now, that's the high-level thing. But let's really talk about why it's so valuable, because the technical part of doing it is only one small part of making a solution that works. If we think about a customer solution, there's the deploying the nodes and setting up the software, but before that, a whole bunch of other stuff. There is designing the solution correctly in the first place. There is the making sure the planning's done correctly, make sure the right IP addresses are set, making sure all the cables are ordered, making sure that the racks can deal with the air conditioning or have got the right power supplies, making sure that the loading bay can take the weights, right? These are things that actually are intrinsic to a working deployment, but often aren't considered about. So really, when we think about deployment, it's an end-to-end scenario. Correct design solution in the first place, full planning in a defined way, completely automated deployment from bare metal to fully working customer-ready solution, and burn-in and validation to make sure the thing actually is stress tested. And that is an end-to-end deployment. So I'll pause there because I'm sure that poses questions for you.
No questions so far.
Okay.
It's just, but what I really see or what I enjoy is working with those customers, like customers and partners, like you know the hardware solutions. So that means you know what you're sending out to the customer. You have also an amazing tool like ScopeSys, where you can create the bombs and for different partners now, and really know what is coming. And this you know the cables, you know the hardware environment, what you will get. That will directly impact the automation. So before the customer gets the hardware delivered, you can just change your script. You can change your deployment according to what hardware you get. Like,
indeed.
Best example is I'm getting a small deployment with only two 25 gigs and two 1 gig NIC interfaces, so I can do a converged configuration. I know that already due to the BOM and due to the order, or I'm getting a large scale environment where I have two 25s for storage, two 10s for compute, and two 1 gig for management, and then change that and being prepared when coming on site to the customer for deployment. And that's I will do another video with Steve, one of my colleagues, about what you should prepare before actually ordering. what thoughts you need to have, and that's really the key part for the automation, especially when you do a new deployment. Know what you get.
So let's get into that, because it's a really good point. Because in fact, this is the key difference between what I'd call a engineer who's got a bunch of PowerShell scripts versus a automation platform, which is a thing that Acuutech's constructed, and that ability to have intelligence. So let's talk about that first point you spoke about. We have this thing called the deployment automation wizard, and we have this environment wizard where the user is asked a number of questions. So in fact, I'm just going to share a slide very briefly, which will kind of help frame this exact point. So let me just bring my screen up. Bear with me 1 second. Let me find my PowerPoint. Let's talk about the on-prem deployment wizard. This is a wizard that the user gets. It's in a piece of software we've written called MIS. And actually, it asks the user a number of questions. So it's asking things, how many nodes are going to be deployed? What seed server or what management service type do they have? And then critically, what is the switch configuration? Is it RDMA direct or is it a switch configuration? And by the way, these things are all key, because under the covers, then the deployment agent drops in the correct settings, as you've just been saying, so that it does the correct configuration for a switch, or does the correct configuration for an RDMA direct, or whether it is fully or semi-converged.
We maybe need to mention here RDMA direct means switchless configuration for storage.
Of course, yes, quite right. Although I'm going to make one thing. I have a bugbear here. It's not switchless. There are no switches for the SMB traffic. There is still a switch for the VM traffic, because as we all know, the number of customers who sit there and go, what do you mean there's no switch? Did I need one? Yes, dear customer. How are you going to connect the rest of your infrastructure? So yes, indeed, RDMA direct to SMB direct or switchless, indeed. Now, but the important thing is the wizard populates settings, and then you spoke about the bombs. One of the covers, actually, the engine actually understands bombs, right? Literally understand bombs. So it understands what sort of CPUs are in them, what sort of peripherals are in them. Critically, it also understands what hard disks are in them. The reason that's important, and if again anyone here who's deployed a Windows OS will know, one of the interesting things about plug and play, for example, is that the order which devices are detected changes, especially depending on how the OEM physically installed the drives. The reason that's important is that the boot drives sometimes end up on different PMP IDs depending on the server. So the fact that the automation understands which devices are the boot drives to be put into a little RAID 1 versus the drives that need to go into the storage space direct pool is incredibly important, right? And this is, I'm sorry, you were going to say something. I'm so sorry.
No, just listening to you.
Yes, indeed. And as we realize, because it understands the BOM, it then understands which driver packages to pull down. Historically, that was pulling down with driver packs from a particular vendor. As we move forward to 23H2, that will be making sure the correct SBE is used, right? And that's really, really important. And also, we now kind of nicely get to that
we maybe need to explain SBE. So as we have an audience which maybe not worked with 23H2 so far.
So that's a really good question. So let's go back in time, or again frame debate. As we all know, operating systems take drivers and firmware, right? And ever since there's been a validation program for Azure Stack HCI, the various certified hardware vendors have provided validated packages of firmware and drivers. That's important because it's not necessarily the latest firmware or latest driver that needs to be used. It's often a particular firmware or particular driver. So using the correct set of drivers is important. Now, to date, the vendors have made available those driver packages via a number of methods, either via their own proprietary tooling or their websites or repositories. As we move forward into the release of Azure Stack HCI that will be coming in the near future, to enhance the user experience, of course, Microsoft really wants to take control of that lifecycle management and update process. That means that the hardware vendors will now provide the drivers and firmware to Microsoft. They will wrap them up inside of a signed package. This thing is known as the SBE, or the Solution Builder Extension, and therefore Microsoft will provide these extensions and the driver packs as part of the deployment and the update experience. It's also worth noting, and this is a great time to talk about some of the changes in Azure Stack HCI in terms of not having code or software written by, shall we say, uncertified vendors running on the nodes. A lot of people seem to think Azure Stack HCI is kind of like Windows Server, and I get why people think that, but it really isn't. An analogy I often use is that Azure Stack HCI to Windows Server is what the Xbox OS is to Windows 11. They're the same core technology, but they're different. And the reason I'm talking about this, of course, is that as we move forward, non-signed, non-Microsoft code cannot execute, cannot run on Azure Stack HCI nodes. And that's really important because it will drive up the availability and drive up the reliability. But it also really changes the way that organizations like Acuutech need to think about deployment automation and management and control, because historically we used to do things like we actually literally ran an agent. We ran an Acuutech agent on the nodes that was the command and control structure that spoke to our cloud automation service. As we move forward, we've actually had to create that as a signed SBE piece of code so that it works correctly as we go forward. So this is good because, okay, it required changes of Acuutech and the other vendors, but it means that the customers know that the code they are running on their platform is signed and certified, right? And that's great because it gives people a better experience. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's more or less a step in the direction of Azure Stack HCI becoming similar to Azure Stack Hub, where we had that already for several years, with the management system the +1 system on top, and then managing all nodes beneath, because that's more or less a capability or a strategy we have in Hub right now, which will then come to the HCI platform.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not shown screen. Right. Yes, indeed. Right. Yeah. You counted again.
Yep. So that's more or less bringing a strategy from the appliance service or appliance to a more open platform, which is, I think in our pre-conversation you said also it's a managed appliance or a validated appliance approach then.
Correct. I love the analogy you're taking, because that really is what Azure Stack HCI is. It's a more open experience because there are a wider range of hardware topologies and configuration, but it is that managed solution to give the user the best of both worlds. And ultimately, as we know, hyperconverged infrastructure solutions are complicated. You know, these are challenging things. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the individual subsystems that make these things up are incredibly complicated, powerful systems that have a lot of configuration and a lot of requirements. Now, for people like myself or you who eat, drink, and sleep these technologies, we are very used to dealing with the nuances of RDMA networking or SRIOV or pool configuration or load balancing, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. But ultimately, the goal and the improvements in Azure Stack HCI and the reason to automate is to just give ultimately customers working solutions, because clients don't care about whether there was a disk failure in the pool. They just want a working platform to allow them to deliver workloads, and that's really what all of us in this sector are looking to give to our customers.
Correct, and that's I think we all agree on. That's one thing HCI is still lacking, is the ease of deploy and ease of management. What you may see with partners like Nutanix, where you have these closed system on a closed platform, but easier to bring into. It's like comparing Windows to Apple.
Yes, correct. That's a great analogy. And in fact, I spend a lot of time talking to the ecosystem. I talk to partners around the world, I talk to customers, and more importantly, I talk to a lot of vendors who work with organizations like Nutanix, and they say exactly what you just said. It's just so easy with Nutanix. It just works with Nutanix. Oh, I just use a Nutanix deployer, right? And then what happens is that they say, oh, Azure Stack HCI is still all the complexity of doing storage spaces direct, right? And actually, one of the reasons Acuutech is so successful with its deployment automation is we say, yes, it is, but actually, the Acuutech bolt-on takes away its complexity, and that's the beauty of it. And in fact, there's a slight adjunct here. I used to run a slide quite regularly, especially during COVID, where I say we're low-touch friendly because we're completely automated and require no technical knowledge. During the COVID lockdowns, we were doing deployments all around the world because engineers, all they had to do was rack and stack, and then everything else was automated in remotely, and that's important.
Just getting it cabled and then configuring the remote management controllers, and you were able to run.
Correct. Yes, and it's funny you say that because we both use the term, oh, just get it cabled. Again, one of the reasons we have so much process is because so many people get that wrong. You're smiling because you well know.
That's why we have this cabling video from Bernhard on the channel, and it's our most successful video. Thousands of people are watching this cabling video.
we have an engineering. We actually have part of our stand-upping procedure. The engineer has to take a photo of the back of the server. So let me tell you a horror story. We were doing a deployment in China, and during the COVID lockdown, and the engineer had cabled up this deployment, and then we were trying to deploy it, and we were getting all sorts of strange behavior. Network interfaces would drop, they would connect, they would drop, IP addresses would fall all over the place. And you can imagine there was some concern with the client and this deployment out in China. And myself and two of my senior engineers, we were looking at this problem for about 15 or 16 hours, non-stop. And as an engineer yourself, it's like, you start to doubt yourself, you try everything, you pull your hair out, what lack of hair I have, with your colleagues. And then we saw strange behavior. And then we phoned them up and said, are you using DAC to RJ45 converters? And they said, some of them. And we said, what do you mean some of them? They said, well, we haven't got enough DAC cables. So on the end of some of the DAC cables, we put DAC to 1 gig RJ45 converters. And then just on some of the others, we put 1 gig to 10 gig converters. And we just plugged them in. Yeah. Yes. At which point, my colleagues who were very tired, probably been up for over 24 hours at this point, probably wanted to inflict, shall we say, some level of irritation to the said engineer. We smiled politely and said, let's stop until we send you the correct cables. But yes, cabling, because as you well know, no amount of automation, no amount of setup guide, no amount of SOP can save you from somebody who does not cable it correctly. Yes.
Again, in our pre-call, I told you the story about the trainee who ran out of 2-meter cables and then used the 200-meter cables to to cable the rest of the servers of the HCI in the rack.
Yes, because the latency on a 2-meter cable and a 200-meter cable will be exactly the same. In fact, this brings me to a similar anecdote. I remember some years ago, I was chatting to a client who said they had an office in New York and another one in Sydney. And they wanted to do fully synchronous storage replication between the two sites over a 6 meg DSL line. Now, yes. Now, at this point, I politely said, that's great. I can't change physics. Realizing they had no idea what I was talking about, I then said, yes, I can't make light go any faster. Right? Yeah. They still had no idea what I was talking about. So I politely said, sure, if you think it's going to work, I'm leaving now. But yes, some people have some very strange ideas. Yes, what can be done? Although we're on that subject, and I always like this analogy. there is a national military, and I won't name them here, who they have something called a aggressive site decommissioning process, right? So the standard operating procedure is referred to as the aggressive site decommissioning process. So what they do is they use storage spaces direct, and they have these racks. So what they do is they have three-way mirrors where two of the racks will be in some secure location, and one of them will be in a forward operating base. Now, during a aggressive site decommissioning, the technique is they put a grenade on the top of the rack and blow it up. Yes. Knowing full well that they have two other copies, but yes. So for certain military, that is their aggressive site decommissioning. Sorry, yes, with a hand grenade.
Sounds similar to what I heard from another customer who said, "Yeah, we need to decommission our data center until that specific date." And I said, "Yeah, what will happen? Yeah, we will just blow up the building."
Yeah. Yes. So we clearly work with clients who have certain solutions. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So anyway, before the two of us get into lots of anecdotes about the fun of deployments, what I think is important for the wider listeners is realizing actually that the automation is a technology bit, but actually these practical techniques you and I are talking about, the correct planning, the correct cabling, actually are key. Right?
That's the baseline for the full automation.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and there's also there's one piece. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. There was something invented that you can when the whole automation deployment and so on started. I think 10 years ago. There were always issues with the network interfaces in Windows Server, which were changing a lot. And then I think it was with Windows Server 2012. It should be Windows Server 2012, where you were able to identify the NICs, and it were always getting the same NIC configuration, and Windows always knew, okay, that's NIC 1, that's NIC 2, that's NIC 3, so I will put them in the right order in the operating system.
Actually,
yeah.
Okay. Right. So yes, but actually, it's still a nightmare. So yes, what you are getting at is the fact that every time Windows would reboot, the NICs would be renumbered. Right, because it depends on where they were detected on the plug and play startup. Yes, I'm right. I can't remember whether it was 2016 or 2012 that finally every time you restarted Windows, they would end up being the same again.
I think it was 2012 or 2012 or 2, so it's pretty old. It was in my old Dell days.
Well, it was certainly pre-switch embedded team. So I'm going to have to go back and look through the engineering specs and check. You've intrigued me now to remember. I know that we still manually do check in our automation to make sure they haven't changed.
Yeah.
Because
but the point is here now a lot of those things happened also due to hardware and people who want to automatically deploy, and that now that's benefiting from all these years over years of innovation and integration into hardware, that we can now do those things.
Yes, well, I'd say the pain of doing these things has been recognized. So there's been improvement in the hardware layer and the software layer to really drive it home. I agree. So these things are not as challenging as they used to be. And in fact, this is a nice pivot to out-of-band management, because one of the things we do, of course, is we take dependency on the industry standard IPMI, right? Because that means we can always address the out-of-band controllers of various vendors, right? And that's great, because the other key thing, apart from once you've ordered the correct equipment and racked it correctly, is you've got to have the UEFI and the BIOS set up correctly. You know, if you don't have your boot orders, if you don't have your security chip enabled correctly, you know, Azure Stack HCI Windows Server is not going to work. So this is also key as part of that first stage, which is, yes, get the BIOS, get the UEFI set correctly, you know, get your disks lined up correctly. And lastly, of course, also configure the switches. Because again, you know, if you do not set your PSC correctly, if you do not set your flow control settings correctly, if you do not tag your VLANs correctly on your switches, none of this is going to work, right? And I'm sure you've sat through many an installation where someone has not correctly controlled their PF settings on their switch, so their RDMA traffic is used up the entire bandwidth of their
not even those complicated things, just setting the correct VLAN configurations on all ports and not just forgetting one port to set the VLAN configurations. That's the most common thing. Just, I forgot to configure the VLANs on that second storage port. That's the reason why it's not working.
Yep, correct. And what's scary, of course, is that, you know, things like Windows Admin Center or even PowerShell don't alert you to that failure. They just fail. Yep. And in fact, again, one of the reasons that Acuutech's automation has become so popular is that, you know, even people who know what they're doing, who try and use Windows Admin Center, fail, right? Because they make the site mistake you've just outlined there, and Windows Admin Center will leave the system in a broken state because it can't complete, and you're just in a horrible mess. Yes, indeed. Yeah, so it's a really, really key point. And this even before we start talking about software-defined networking, because, you know, the joys of correctly setting up your BGP and correctly setting up your VIPs is a layer of complexity most customers just do not understand.
Yep. We will not go deep into software-defined networking on that one because we had a ask from Kyle that we do a software-defined networking together, because again, you have a great automation solution for that, and lots of experience we should share. But yeah, being a customer right now, why, even with only deploying one cluster, in, let's say I want to deploy one cluster, I could do it manually. Sure. Why shouldn't I?
So let's answer that question several ways. Let's assume, first of all, that you are the sysadmin for this customer. You are competent with IT systems, you know, whatever they are, but you don't particularly know anything about Azure Stack HCI, right? But you've read all your articles, you've read the Microsoft Help Guide, you've swallowed the cool pill that Windows Admin Center is going to work, right? The reality is that you are going to be left with a broken deployment, where still you probably will not have the skill set to fix it, which means that you are going to have to start spending some money to make it work. So that's that scenario. The other scenario is the one where you are technically competent. You probably know lots about Azure Stack HCI, right? And then it's they also have challenges doing themselves because for the, oh, I just forgot this, I forgot to do that port, and then you end up in a mess as well. So you've got to get help, right? And really, it's a cost and outcome conversation because let's use a car analogy. I expect you and I both know how to drive cars, right? I expect you and I both probably know how to change the oil or put a tire onto a car, right? We don't expect to change the oil or put the tires onto a car when we pick a new one up from the dealership, because the dealership does it correctly and gets it configured correctly, so we know it's set up correctly. Yeah. It's a very similar situation here. And in fact, I'll give a nice analogy. Sand vendors don't let you put sands together by hands. So why would you try and set up a complicated hyper-converged appliance by your hands? That's probably the best analogy.
And even if we do it once, when I talk to my customers and think just try to get it automated in the first place, because it already includes your your documentation. You just need to write a few things around it because you knew how it was set up. It's already a bit of a documentation, and you could repeat it in a 6 months to 1 year, and you would have the same configuration for the other clusters. So that even if we and we know that since years, even if we set up Windows Server in the same way and always in the same way, there is some kind of difference between the nodes. And with an automated deployment, you know, okay, that are guardrails in which the deployment will run, or how it will look like, and you know how it reacts. And yeah, maybe I need to adjust to a newer version or something like that, but it's just adjusting those lines, even as it in a smaller deployment. And
I agree. Yes, and in fact, a colleague of mine has a very good way of describing this. He says, look, you know, you can give the same engineer an SOP, a standard operating procedure, and tell them to do it 10 times, and every time they'll do it differently. In other words, exactly what you're saying. Yes, that's why automation helps.
And what I really like is most of those automations are cumulative. So when you add another node, you can run it again, and it will add the node with the same configuration. It's not like you sitting down there configuring our storage interfaces, configuring the replication and so on, and then putting the node into the cluster, or putting a node into a cluster and do it afterwards, depending on the method you want to use. It will do the things for you, and it will set up the node the same way like the others are, without any mistakes.
Correct. And I guess this now brings us on to the thing that people never think about Azure Stack HCI, in fact, any clustered solution, which is the node isn't important. And what I mean by that is that a node failing or a node bug checking, purpley screen of death as it is these days, or turquoise screen of death, bug check is the official term, doesn't matter. And this isn't anything to particularly do with Azure Stack HCI, but because people always think their server is important. They think, oh no, my server's gone wrong. Doesn't matter. These are cluster solutions that are inherently distributed. Distributed compute, distributed networking, distributed storage. The whole point of storage spaces direct is that you can lose two nodes perfectly happily. So when a node goes wrong, there's no point these days ever trying to fix it or debug it or pull out traces. Who cares, right? If it's a hardware fault, replace the faulty component and just rebuild it. Picking up on what you just said, because of automation, you can rebuild these things very easily. And Azure Stack HCI will inherently rebalance the rebalance the storage, and Hyper-V using its distributed algorithms will rebalance the virtual machines as well, right? And that's a faster, quicker, and easier scenario than running around with metaphorical screwdrivers. And that's one of the big advantage of clustered solutions.
Yeah. I have an analogy to that, like don't treat your servers like your pets. It's not your dog. It's a piece of meat. You eat it and get the next one.
Yes. That is a very, very, very good analogy. Although for all of our vegans and perhaps for our vegans and vegetarians, we should say it's like an Impossible Burger. There we are. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes. But yes, I do like your analogy. Yes, indeed. And that's the point. And this also brings me on actually about hardware lifecycle, because as we're having an open conversation, I can talk about something that the OEMs don't really like talking about. So one of the beauties of Azure Stack HCI is heterogeneous hardware support, right? Storage Spaces Direct has always been able to cope with heterogeneous hardware. And since 21H2, Hyper-V is very good at dealing with mixed CPU generations inside of the same cluster.
Even if it's not recommended, we need to say this.
Indeed.
Yes, it's not recommended, but it's working.
You're saying, yes. Well, it's the CPU version stuff is a feature of 21H2, so it is a feature. Yep. But the reason I'm getting at this, and it's why both of us are kind of going, this is a grey area, is the whole point of cluster solution is it's easy to add new nodes and it's easy to retire them. Now, the reason that's beneficial is customers can buy a system today, and then in 2 or 3 years' time, they can put more nodes into it, and those nodes can have a more powerful specification, right? And then they can retire the old nodes. And the reason that's important, and I talk about a lot with organizations about the ultimate return on investment to moving to hyperconverged, is you never now have to upgrade your software applications in line with your infrastructure. Because what used to happen, and again, you and I have been doing this for long enough, that a infrastructure solution was designed and built around the software that's going to run on it. So, you had your app, you built your platform ran your app for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however long, you threw the whole lot in the bin, you got the new version of the app. Now, your application version lifecycle can be independent of your hardware lifecycle and your Azure Stack HCI software version lifecycle. And that empowers organizations. And the reason, again, you and I are kind of going, possible, not recommended, is all this is technically possible, but of course the hardware vendors don't really have a certification story. However, they're going to, because as we move forward, some of these early Azure Stack HCI systems are going 3 or 4 years of end of life. Customers will be looking to put new nodes into them, and then we're going to start seeing this scenario more common.
Or already have those configurations, or those customer asking for how to work with their old hardware. So as I started 3 years ago with the whole journey, I said I'm not a friend of mixed clusters due to my past as a cluster MVP, it's still there. But you're right. It's working,
okay.
but it's still with a bit of pain.
2003 clusters. Yeah, okay. So I would agree. I would have never done it with Server 2003. I'd have never done it with 2008. 2012 onwards, it's not too bad. Not with Hyper-V though. Yeah. And Hyper-V was always a nasty thing because let's face it. What was it? What was it used to be called? CPU compatibility mode, where effectively it made the VM think it was like a Intel MX2.
You lost 30% of the performance when you run in compatibility mode. That's
it's like CPU compatible. Yeah, not good. But since 21H2, it's a lot better. Yes, it is. So also for the wider audience who may be listening to this as we're both getting into this, the component you can't change is networking.
Yeah.
So it's very clear. You've got flexibility on NIC, you've got flexibility on CPU, and of course you've got flexibility on GPU, but the network cards not only have to be the same make and series, they have to be exactly the same model. Asymmetric network configurations are not supported, much as I wish they were.
Yeah.
Yes.
But and as we know, NVIDIA or Mellanox, now NVIDIA is shipping a new version of their cards every 1 year, 1.5 years. So the chances are high that you will get different cards, or even with new partners like Marvel showing up, you will maybe also see vendors switching to those chips instead of going with the expensive NVIDIA ones.
Yes, indeed. So now, of course, we can have the great debate of Rocky versus RDMA. Where do you land on the Rocky versus RDMA? Say Rocky versus IWAP.
From the ease of things, I'm still prefer IWAP.
Interesting.
Because I can run it on every switch without support of data center bridging.
But
and
I would argue, but you still need PFC though. You still need PFC.
You still need PFC, but even few of my smaller switches have those. From a supportability and from a product strategy perspective, IWAP is currently on a dying page, and everyone is jumping to Rocky. And
interesting. I hadn't caught this. It enlightened me. What's driving the transition to Rocky rather than IWAP?
Personally, I don't know. So at the moment, there's only one vendor left who's at least in the enterprise space. I know Intel with the old QLogic acquisition, and now the discussion I had personally with a few people from Intel or old QLogic guys said, we will not invest into IWAP any longer. So we are the only ones on the market. Everyone is buying Rocky, and most likely driven by NVIDIA now. And also Microsoft is heavily investing in Rocky due to Azure. AWS is doing the same. So the investments from those major hyperscalers are on the improvement of Rocky. And as the last existing vendor, you will not invest in IWAP because it's not the widely adopted solution. Even if Rocky is complex to set up and requires a lot more from the switches, it became the more powerful and more adopted protocol for RDMA. And that's basically the reason is because of the 3-4 major hyperscalers, because they adopted that duty. It is again something we need to go back to the early days of Azure, of AWS. It's because they all bought Mellanox.
Yep, but they were all IB. They were all InfiniBand. Yes, exactly.
Yep. They were all InfiniBand. They were all Mellanox. And now with NVIDIA as also an AI partner, they have the commercial background to drive those technologies, drive those improvement enhancements to the protocol itself, and yet they committed to Rocky. And that's what we are now seeing on the market. Rocky heavily evolving. And even the SmartNICs we are now seeing. There are things. It was Project Catapult from Azure in 2015, where we started with the FPGAs on those cards, and now these FPGAs are now integrated in everything you get, or also the AI servers from and boards which are marketed from NVIDIA through Gigabyte, those are invented by the hyperscalers, majorly
Yep.
by Microsoft. And there was an announcement yesterday, I think, that we put 110 million in an AI chip company to have an additional vendor in this space.
Interesting. So it's really interesting you just said, because personally I've always been a fan of Rocky, always have been, because although it's more complicated, it is more stable. And the one exception, of course, is long range, because making long range Rocky work for storage replica is a nightmare. So for long range,
I should talk to Didier van Hooyen. He has.
Didier and I have had some wonderful conversations over the year on the subject. Yes, indeed. Yes. In fact, so Didier was listening to some. I remember many years ago, in fact, it was still TechEd. I delivered a session in TechEd, and he came up to me, and he and I had a wonderful, I think, 45-minute conversation about iWarp versus Rocky and long-range iWarp and long-range Rocky. And I remember a large group around us were looking very concerned and confused about what these two lunatic Europeans were yelling at each other about. Yes, indeed. Yes, because they had no idea what we were talking about. But yes, no, Didier is very passionate on the subject and knows it very, very, very well indeed. Yes, no, it's good fun when I get to talk to him about the subject. Yes, indeed. But it's also very interesting you put up the FPGA thing, because the thing I wish, and again, we're moving slightly off tangent here, but the thing I've always wished Azure Stack HCI would do is, of course, put the storage network compute on an FPGA, because, of course, that frees up all of the RAM, CPU. So you run the entire OS on the FPGA on the SmartNIC, and everything else is on. Yes, much more logical. I appreciate the hardware vendors don't like that idea, but imagine the situation where you just on the FPGA, Core OS, go to RAM resident,
and it's working. It's working at Azure. So Azure is using the FPGAs
I didn't know we were going to be open about it, but yes, indeed.
It's on OpenCompute. I can talk about it. I can link it in the description. It's all OpenCompute. You can buy those SmartNICs. It's in Project Catapult. It's explained in the patent of the colleagues. So that's if you know where to read it, it's there. So we can talk about it openly.
And if I remember correctly. The whole thing's only on 18 meg. I think it's tiny. It's an absolutely tiny footprint. It's very, very, very small on the FPGA. Yes, indeed. Very.
There's also a session from Mark Rosinovich explaining that in deep. I need to put that in the video description. So that's an amazing session. It's a pretty old one, but it really explains the topic. And don't do it in. You maybe need to watch it 3 to 6 times to understand everything. But it's an amazing session, and that's where we're coming from, and it's also where we see where our automation is coming from, where our whole system is coming from. And it's not. It's not a bad thought to, if FPGA on NICs is becoming more widely adopted, becoming cheaper. So currently, such a SmartNIC is, I think, 12,000 euros with 2-port 25 gig, something like that. So it's not widely adoptable. But if that's at some point moves into an HCI, and that if we ask for that feature, and if we are enough asking for that feature, it can become widely adopted. With that, the hardware becomes much cheaper, and then it will maybe find its way in our servers.
Exactly. Yes, and then that will really help the user base. Also, it'll redefine the way we think about scoping, because we never have to worry about overhead anymore, because the overhead's just on the SmartNIC. Yes, so the whole resource of the server is available for workload. And that's kind of an interesting thing. And that probably is a nice segue into let's talk about scoping. So, I have some views here. So, and I'm sure you've experienced it. Scoping infrastructure solutions is complicated, right? Because, and most people don't do it correctly. The reason most people don't do it correctly is that they broadly speaking do one of two things. They look at all their virtual machine workloads and their containerized workloads. They tot up all the cores they've got, and then all the RAM they've got, and then arbitrarily go, oh, I don't know, I'm going to run a physical to virtual ratio of, I don't know, 1 to 2, 1 to 5, just pick a number, right? Then they go and find some servers that have got enough cores and enough RAM. Then they work out all their storage, multiply it by 3 or 0.5 if they're doing parity map or three-way mirror, and then they look at the hardware vendors' websites, right? And hope. That's how most people do it. And you're nodding because you've seen it a million times, right? And the reason that's incredibly flawed is because, one, they have absolutely no idea how those systems are going to behave on physical hardware. Two, they have no idea whether they've got any VMs that are larger than individual nodes core count. Three, they might do something, they've got no way of knowing, for example, if they're going to, I don't know, I'm using an example, they put 200 terabytes of NVMe storage into the node, and then they put 110 gig NIC in. Because the hardware vendors' configurations will let you laugh, but you've seen them do it. Yes, you know, and it's the thing, because if you look at a Dell or an HP or a Lenovo certified configuration tool, it will let people make these mistakes because they are, yes, certified configurations. They're not sensible, you know. I was working with a partner recently who, in fact, one of my colleagues worked with him, where they sent us a proposed specification and they were running a physical to virtual control contention ratio of 1 to 47. Yes, which unsurprisingly wasn't going to work. So you know, there are challenges with scoping. And one of the things architects also go ahead. I'm so sorry.
And it also depends, really, as you said, on the application itself. So I worked for a governmental institute within Germany, who is still using Office 95 for their document management system on the terminal server. So it's a single core application running on the terminal server. So what do you think, where and especially on Xen and VMware with the non-thread scheduler, where do you think would all those VMs from all those users running these Office 365 application end? On which CPU core? 0.
I'm assuming it's going to be 0, 0. Yes.
0, 0, and everything else was idle.
Yep.
And if you need to know your applications in this, so that's really, and it was always, I did the analysis and say, guys, you need to have a different hypervisor who is thread based. So basically Hyper-V that time, that because every mouse click is a thread for the CPU. Every open Office 95 is a thread for the CPU, so it can load balance. Yes, you maybe lose a bit of performance on that single core, but you would now use all your cores instead of core 0. Or
and do you know what? This really nicely brings you on. I'm so glad you've spoken about the application, because when I talk to organizations about physical to virtual contention, I say things, okay, so if you want to, say, run a 1-to-2 ratio, do your apps on, let's say you've got 2 apps or 2 VMs, do they never consume more than 50% of a core? Yes. If they don't, 1 to 2 is fine, right? If you want to run 1 to 4, do all of your apps never consume more than 25% of a core? And of course, what always amazes me is people don't do this simple real world evaluation. It's just like they ran the app. Of course it runs on 0 because it's an ancient app, because people, and I'm sure you find this as well, people seem to think magic happens when it comes to virtualization, or there's magic in hyperconvergence. Oh, it'll just work. No, real world computer science still applies. And this is key to scoping.
And another example, when I was at Dell, I did a lot of troubleshooting, also performance troubleshooting, somehow ended up on my desk. And there was a customer ordered new Dell servers with AMD, I think a lot of cores that time, and coming from Intel Xeon. And they ran, was it Oracle? I think they ran Oracle, and they said we have a lower performance on the newer systems with more cores than on the old system with less cores. And the reason was the newer AMD systems were running with a lower clock speed than the old Intel systems, and the application was highly dependent on the clock speed of a single core. And it could also happen in virtualization. You can get more cores, but if you have applications, databases most likely, who are used to run parts of them in a single core, and then having you coming from an older platform where you have definitely higher clock speeds.
Yep.
It could be and especially from hardware perspective, coming from hardware with a higher clock speed versus virtualization, where you share the threads, where you share the schedule of a CPU, it could run slower. So you need to you need to calculate that you maybe have a higher ratio, or if it's not using the full physical CPU running on physical, you can go for a less configuration, as you said. But it's all, and no one can tell you, no vendor, no partner can tell you that you need to know your workload.
You have to do the math. You have got to do the math. And again, I'm really glad you brought up this whole point about clock speed, because you say so many people just assume that, oh, faster, newer CPU must be faster. No, if the clock speed is slower on a single core, the slower clock speed will be slower than a single core from the other server. It's because the clock speed is lower. And you say, for a non-parallelized application, it's going to run slower. The other one I've run into is people who seem to magically think that, oh, one virtual CPU in a VM, well, that will magically take advantage of two physical CPUs. Yes, and again, I'm not sure if it's naivety or, again, it's just a misunderstanding, but you see this happen all the time, that people just don't grasp these practical things.
Yeah, that's here. It's really so we are far out of our original conversation, but it's really we should do another one about those discussions. But it's virtualization discussions, but it's really depending on the scheduler you use. If you have a V2C scheduler, so which is pinning your workload, the virtual code to a physical CPU, yes, you will gain the full performance, but you will not scale through the other CPUs or the other cores. But if you have a thread-based CPU scheduler, then you can take advantage of all the CPUs, but it will be a bit slower. You saw that in the early versions of Windows Server on Hyper-V, where you have, over time, there was per clock 1 nanosecond added to in time difference from the physical machine to the virtual machine. And I think after 2 weeks, you ran out of schedule because there were a time difference from 15 minutes between your virtual machine and your physical system, which was horrible when virtualizing domain controllers.
Well, actually, if you remember it broke quicker than that, as soon as they were 5 minutes out, you'd had it.
Wrap it up from an automation perspective, and we should continue the conversation on another video. So leave us comments if you want to see more. Bioautomation is key. So you have if you know your BOM, you can really do great automation, especially with the toolings that you have. Or not spoiling, there are a few things not such powerful than your tooling, but also coming into the product. But as you add the additional percent Microsoft.
And that's spot on, because if we look at the roadmap and new stuff that we're not particularly something here, but we know is coming, that's what there's some improvements. But again, we're augmenting those improvements to make it the 100% and make it customer ready. And that's the value proposition. It comes back to my opening statement. Our value is delivering business ready solutions.
Yeah, and that's one thing Microsoft can't do. Microsoft needs to bring a solution for 80% or 70% of the market, so more general, and then there's specific requests or specific needs like unattended automation deployment, or let's say the lack of knowledge to do the last 30% on your own, where solutions like the one from Acuutech jump in that help us as a vendor to bring the full, and that's why you're getting paid for it, basically, by programs from us or by customers to get the full experience and get your knowledge. And it's important to have those automations in the first place, to have a consistent deployment over different deployments, or even for one, have already a documentation in place. Do not forget anything. Do not make dumb mistakes. And being able to repeat it, optimize it. And in addition, you can then easily add new nodes and also rip and replace nodes without going through the whole hassle again. Remember what you configured, maybe doing again mistakes or having a misconfiguration, which then brings down the cluster, because it's all out. Everything is in automation. It will be the same, and it will, even if you invest in the first place to creating the automation, at the end you will save time later on. And even and another thing, which could happen, it happened to me, it happened to you, it happened to all of us. We got sick, we had an accident, we have family things we need to deal with, and we are not reachable. Someone can go and say, the node is dead, it has a blue screen, just reinstall the operating system, or just hit rip and replace in the Acuutech app and redeploy it with specific nodes. It does not require that specific person for those day-to-day tasks. And that those person can concentrate on new things, can invest time into previews, into learning new things. It frees up and will give room to grow. And it's one thing I personally encountered is, if I do that, I will lose my job because I'm replaceable. No, you're not replaceable, because that frees up your time to become a better expert, and you will get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I'm going to amplify that statement another way, where I chat to a lot of partners, because sometimes IT partners get worried, because as you know, we work very closely with Lenovo, and we provide a lot of automation into Lenovo, and sometimes their partners in the ecosystem say, but hold on, if we take this Acuutech powered service, we're removing our value. And I say, no, we take care of this thing for you, which allows you to specialize in all the places you are strong. You can now do all the stuff on top of this to drive your value, and that's the key thing. So this is about empowering enablement, as you say. It's not about stopping people having jobs.
It helps you to focus on your core business. It's like digitalization in the industry, where everyone needs to become an IT company. Even if you just have a wood saw or something, or you're producing something like pipes, you need to know about your business, and therefore you need to have IT.
Right.
If you do it on your own, you're investing much more time on the IT you need to do, and you will lose time. You need to invest on your core business, inventing new pipes, inventing new materials you can use, improving your production processes to be more efficient. And maybe it will also reshape your core business. So, for example, a friend, just bring it to example too. So, a friend of mine who worked for a large shipping company, who said, I cannot make enough money to cover my cost from shipping goods, because there's not enough margin on transportation anymore, because there's so many of us. But what I can do money with is data. Yeah. I know there was a wood fire in the US, so I need to send fire extinguishers from Europe to the US. So can select a ship which is maybe in Rotterdam or in some harbor where I can buy those goods pretty cheap, and I will send them over, because I know those data, and I know that the US, in New York maybe, or in Philadelphia, they will need to have these fire extinguishers because of a new policy in 12, 17 months or something. So I can tell that I can ship them over in the meantime and sell them pretty expensive to when they arrive or in the shipment. And also just quick, and also what I learned from my ships is I have a lot of sensors. I know about the waves, I know about the weather, I know about how my superstructure reacts on certain scenarios, on certain load. I can sell those data to others who run more or less the same ship type, and they need that for insurance and reinsurance of goods. So they buying from, or they're giving me money for my data for their ships, so that they can do their insurance much more efficient. And there will always be such companies who provide you with the data based on their business, and you can then leverage those data to make your business much more efficient.
Exactly. Yes,
And
exactly.
here again, you don't want to invest on the IT yourself. You want to have automation. You want to have a solution in place which does it for you because it's not your core business.
And it's funny you say this now because I remember almost 2 decades ago, I made a prediction that I thought it'd be about 15 years where unless a company's business is IT, you won't have an internal IT department. Now, it took more than 15 years and we're still not quite there. But I genuinely think in the next 5 to 10 years, exactly what you just said, unless your business is IT, you won't have an IT department because they're not driving your business forward. They are actually just being a cost to your business, right? In the same way as finance has been outsourced or HR has been outsourced, IT ultimately will become a complete outsource and service consumption-based activity. And that's as we move forward, indeed. Yep. Yes. So we bring it to a close there because I'm sure there's lots of conversations we could have, but perhaps we hold that for another day for our various audiences.
Yeah. So, but I think we explained it pretty good that why automation is so important. We will also put the links to your tooling in the video description so that the people can read through it. And I think you have also a good repository on videos on your channel, so I will link everything of that. And yes. Of course, I think people who are interested can also ping you on LinkedIn, or they can ping me, and I will bring you, all of you in contact.
They will find various Acuutech staff on LinkedIn. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes, so they can reach us. Yes, indeed, which will be really good. Fantastic. Yeah. And as you say, I think there's lots of opportunities for us to discuss other topics. Hopefully, the audience are interested.
I think we have already a large list. So your CTO provided me already with a large list of topics he want to talk about and with the people. So I think Terry will also be on one of the calls. They would talk with Tony and a lot of people from Acuutech because you are one of the most advanced partners here, and also it can deliver a lot of insights even I can't deliver or my team can't deliver because we work a lot with the customers. We work a lot with the product groups, but we are not a partner. We maybe have a different view.
Yes.
And that makes the whole conversation so important. Also to talk with people like you on the channel to get all these different views and open opinions.
Exactly. Wonderful.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for being here, having that open discussion. And if there is, it would be great to capture another one with you at some point.
It would be an absolute pleasure to.
Perfect. Then, for everyone out there, if you do not want to miss those conversations, if you don't want to miss the new upcoming instructions from Bernhard regarding 23H2 and so on. Subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, leave us comments, leave us feedback, also product feedback if you like, and also feedback to our friends from Acuutech. That's basically it for today. Thank you
guys so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.